Close your eyes for a moment, my friends. Imagine you are standing on the banks of a river so wide it looks like a sea. The air is thick and heavy with the smell of wet mud, blooming jasmine, and expensive incense. You can hear the rhythmic sound of water hitting the wooden sides of a grand ship. The sun is setting, turning the sky into a deep, bruised purple. In the distance, the great library of Alexandria stands like a mountain of white marble. This was the world of Cleopatra. She was a woman whose name has lived for 2,000 years, but she was not just a queen in a gold dress. She was a survivor. Imagine a young woman hidden inside a simple laundry bag made of rough, gray cloth. She's being carried through the dark, cold hallways of a palace she once called home. Her breath is shallow. Her heart beats like a trapped bird against its cage. Outside the door, Roman soldiers guard the halls with sharp spears and iron shields. Their heavy boots make a slow, rhythmic clicking sound on the stone floor. If she is discovered, her life will end before the moon disappears. Why would a queen hide herself in such a humble way? To understand this moment of extreme danger, we must look back at the fires that forged her. Cleopatra lived in a world where family was the most dangerous thing of all. Her ancestors had ruled Egypt for 300 years, but they did not rule with love. They ruled with fear and cold ambition. She watched her brothers and sisters fight for power like hungry wolves in the dark. She saw very early that a crown was not a gift. A crown was a target. This realization changed everything for her. It made her understand that she could not rely on her bloodline alone. She had to become something more. She had to become a master of the mind. As she lay inside that dark bag, waiting to be revealed to Julius Caesar, she did not feel fear. She felt a deep, cold focus. She knew that her words would be her only weapon in this room of soldiers. She had spent years preparing for this single night. She had studied the languages of the desert and the philosophies of the ancient Greeks. She knew the history of every empire that had risen and fallen before her time. Now, the weight of the Nile rested on her shoulders. The shadow of Rome was growing longer every day. She was the only one who could stop it from swallowing her home. The palace was quiet, but it was a heavy silence. It was the kind of silence that comes before a great storm. Cleopatra knew that the man waiting in the next room held the fate of the world in his hands. Julius Caesar was a general who had conquered nations. He was a man of logic and steel. How could a young woman with no army convince him to help her? She knew she couldn't use force. She had to use something much more powerful. She had to use a vision of the future. She thought about the farmers in the fields who depended on the Nile. She thought about the scholars in the library who protected the world's knowledge. If she failed tonight, all of it would burn. The Roman soldiers would strip the gold from the temples. They would take the grain from the storehouses. Egypt would become nothing more than a slave to Rome. She felt the rough fabric of the laundry bag against her face. It was a reminder of how far she had fallen and how high she had to climb back up. Suddenly, the bag was lifted. She felt the movement of the person carrying her. Every step felt like an eternity. The air inside the bag was hot and thin. She closed her eyes and practiced her first words in Latin. She had to sound like a queen, even as she looked like a prisoner. This was the moment everything changed. The door opened with a slow creak. The destiny of Egypt was about to be decided in a room filled with candle smoke and maps of war. Let's go back far back into the mists of time. Cleopatra was born into a palace filled with gold, but the air was often filled with ice. Her family, the Ptolemies, were originally from Greece. They lived as Egyptian gods, but they never forgot their roots. As a child, Cleopatra walked through gardens where the statues were taller than the trees. But she did not play with wooden toys or silken dolls like other children of her rank. Instead, she spent her days in the great library of Alexandria. The library was her true home. It was a place of silence and shadows, filled with thousands of papyrus scrolls. They smelled of ancient dust and forgotten wisdom. While her siblings played in the palace fountains, Cleopatra sat with old teachers. She learned to speak 9 languages before she was a teenager. She spoke the language of the Hebrews, the Medes, and the Ethiopians. Most importantly, she was the first in her family to learn the language of the Egyptian people. She wanted to hear their voices, not just their prayers. She wanted to understand the farmers who worked under the hot sun. She watched her father, King Ptolemy XVI, struggled to keep his throne from breaking. He was a man who loved the music of the flute more than he loved the strategy of his army. Cleopatra saw him bow low to the Roman generals just to keep his crown. She saw the shame in his eyes when he had to borrow money from foreign banks. She realized early that beauty was a fading flower. It would dry and blow away in the desert wind. But knowledge? Knowledge was a sharp sword that stayed sharp forever. She studied the stars to understand the cycles of time. She studied mathematics to understand the flow of money in the markets. She studied the art of persuasion to understand the secrets of the human heart. She was preparing for a war that hadn't even started yet. The palace was a beautiful cage. There were spies behind every curtain and poison in many cups. Cleopatra learned to watch the eyes of the servants. She learned to listen to what was not being said. Her childhood was a long, difficult lesson in survival. She watched her older sisters try to take the throne by force. She saw them fail because they were driven by anger, not by thought. She saw that anger was a fire that burned the whole house down. She preferred the light of a lamp. Intelligence was a lamp that showed the way through the dark. She grew up with the sound of many languages in her ears and the weight of history in her soul. She knew that the flutes of her father's palace would one day stop playing. She knew the Roman swords would eventually be drawn against her people. She intended to be the only person in the room who knew exactly what to do when the music ended. One afternoon, she stood on a high balcony looking out at the lighthouse of Alexandria. It was one of the wonders of the world, sending a beam of fire across the dark sea. She realized that she wanted to be like that light. She wanted to be a guide for her country during its darkest night. But she also knew that the higher the light burns, the more people want to blow it out. She felt a cold shiver despite the heat of the Egyptian sun. Her father often took her to see the great monuments of the past. They stood before the pyramids, which were already thousands of years old. The stones remember everything, her father told her quietly. Cleopatra touched the warm stone and wondered if the stones would one day remember her. She didn't want to be just another name on a long list of kings. She wanted to be the queen who saved the Nile from the shadow of the eagle. The transition from a princess to a queen was not a gentle one. When her father died, the laws of Egypt forced Cleopatra to share her power. She had to rule alongside her younger brother, a boy who was easily controlled by others. Her ideas were too bold, and her mind was too sharp for the men in the palace. They did not want a queen who could think for herself. They wanted a puppet who would dance when they pulled the strings. Conflict grew like a weed in the palace garden. Her brother's advisors whispered lies in the dark. They told the people that Cleopatra was a traitor. Soon, the city turned against her. She was forced to flee from the marble halls into the harsh, burning desert. She stood on the sand, looking back at the lights of Alexandria. She had lost her home, her crown, and her safety. The desert wind felt like a cold hand on her skin. She sat in her tent, listening to the silence of the dunes. Doubt began to creep into her mind like a shadow. Had she been too proud? Had she spoken too loudly? She remembered the smell of the library scrolls and compared it to the smell of dust. Everything she had worked for seemed to be disappearing into the wind. Her rejection was not just a political defeat. It was a personal wound that refused to heal. Unexpected obstacles appeared at every turn. She tried to raise an army from the desert tribes, but many were afraid of the Roman power supporting her brother. She had no gold to pay for loyalty, only her promises. Every night, she looked at the horizon, hoping to see a sign of change. But the horizon remained empty. She was a queen without a kingdom, a leader without a single soldier to command. She realized that the world she knew was gone. The marble floors were replaced by rough sand. The silk robes were replaced by simple wool. This was her first true taste of failure, and it was bitter. She felt the weight of her father's legacy pressing down on her. She had promised to protect the Nile, but now she could barely protect herself. The fear of being forgotten by history started to feel very real, but even in this failure, she did not stop observing. She watched how the desert people survived with very little. She watched the movements of the stars to keep her mind sharp. She realized that power is not just about a chair or a crown. Power is the ability to wait for the right moment. She took a deep breath of the dry air and made a decision. She would not be a victim of her circumstances. She would be the architect of her return. In the desert, the nights are long and the silence is heavy. Cleopatra lived in a tent made of rough goat hair that scratched her skin. She ate simple bread that was often filled with sand, a far cry from the honeyed cakes of the palace. This was her lowest emotional moment. She was far from the cool, flowing water of the palace fountains and the soft music of the flutes. She looked at her reflection in a small, cracked bronze mirror by the light of a single candle. The girl she used to be, the protected princess, was gone. In her place was a woman who had seen the true, cold face of betrayal. She wondered if she would die in the sand, a name forgotten by history before it was ever truly written. Every morning, she woke to the sound of the desert wind shaking the walls of her tent. It sounded like the whispers of the enemies who had stolen her life. Her brother was celebrating his victory in Alexandria, sitting on the throne that belonged to her. Her enemies were powerful, and their Roman-backed armies grew larger every day. She had no soldiers to fight for her, and no gold to buy loyalty from the local tribes. She felt a deep, empty hole where her hope used to be, a weight in her chest that made even breathing feel like a struggle. She was a ghost haunting the edges of her own kingdom. The heat of the day burned her spirit, and the freezing cold of the desert night chilled her bones. She saw the bleached skeletons of animals that had failed to find the oasis. She realized that the desert does not care about titles. It does not care if you are a queen or a slave. It only cares if you have the strength to endure the sun. This was the crisis of her soul, a moment where the world felt like it was ending. She sat alone watching the sand dunes shift and change shape, realizing that her life was just as unstable as the ground beneath her. She thought about her father's failure and how the Roman eagle was circling her country, waiting for it to die. If she gave up now, Egypt would become nothing more than a farm for Rome. The great library would be neglected, and the ancient traditions would be lost to time. The responsibility felt like a mountain she had to carry alone. Every path seemed to lead to a dead end, and every plan she made felt like a whisper against a storm. She felt the crushing pressure of being the last hope for a 3,000-year-old civilization. But in the deepest darkness of that tent, a small, stubborn flame began to burn in her heart. She realized that while her enemies could take her palace, they could not take her education. They could take her gold, but they could not take the 9 languages she spoke or the history she had memorized. She began to study the movements of the Roman armies nearby with the focus of a hawk. She watched the way the wind moved the sand, learning to find patterns in the chaos. She started to build a new kind of power, not one made of swords, but one made of perfect timing and absolute bravery. She decided that she would not wait for the world to save her. She would create a moment so bold that history would have no choice but to stop and watch. She looked at the stars, the same stars that guided the ancient pharaohs, and felt a connection to the long line of kings before her. Her rejection had not broken her. It had stripped away everything that was not essential. She was now a weapon, sharpened by the desert and ready to be used. The crisis was not her end. It was the birth of the queen the world would never forget. The news reached her that Julius Caesar, the most powerful man in Rome, had arrived in Alexandria. This was the spark she needed. She knew she could not fight an army, so she decided to win a mind. She traveled in secret across the dangerous landscape, avoiding the spies sent by her brother. She reached the city under the cover of a moonless night, her heart racing as she looked at the palace from the shadows. She knew that if she were caught, her journey would end in a dark cell or worse. This leads us back to the moment of the laundry bag. She arrived at the palace, but she could not walk through the front gate where the guards stood. She asked a loyal friend to roll her inside a large bundle of linen, a simple and humble hiding place. He carried her past the guards, claiming it was a gift for the Roman general. When the bundle was finally opened in Caesar's private room, she stepped out into the light. She was dusty and tired from the journey, but she stood tall. She did not beg for her life or for her throne. Instead, she spoke to Caesar in his own language, using the rhythm of a poet and the logic of a scholar. She did not talk about her brother's mistakes or the pain of her exile. She spoke of the future of the world. She spoke of how Egypt and Rome could be the two eyes of a single great empire. Caesar was a man who had seen every beauty and fought every battle, yet he had never met a woman who spoke to him as an equal. Caesar was fascinated by her mind and her courage. He saw more than a queen. He saw a partner who understood the weight of power. That night, the path of history shifted forever. The decision to enter that palace in a bag was the turning point of her life. She had risked everything on a single conversation, By the time the sun rose over the harbor, she was no longer a refugee hiding in the sand. She was Caesar's ally. Her brother's advisors were terrified when they heard the news. They had expected a war of swords and shields, but they had been defeated by a war of words and vision. Cleopatra walked through the palace again, but this time the Roman soldiers saluted her. She felt the cold marble beneath her feet and realized the desert had made her stronger. She was a queen again, but she was different now. She was a leader who knew exactly what she was willing to sacrifice to keep her crown. She looked out at the Nile from her balcony and saw the first light of dawn. The river looked like a ribbon of liquid silver. She knew the struggle was not over, but the direction had changed. She had turned her lowest moment into her greatest opportunity. The world was watching, and she was ready to show them the true power of Egypt. Winning the throne was only the beginning of a long and difficult journey. For many years, Cleopatra worked to rebuild her broken country with the discipline of a soldier and the mind of a scholar. She did not spend her days resting on silk cushions or listening to music in the shade. Instead, she sat at her heavy wooden desk until the oil in her lamps ran low and the moon was high in the sky. She managed the grain harvest to make sure her people did not go hungry during the lean years. She fixed the laws that had been broken by greedy men who cared only for their own pockets. She was the heart, the brain, and the shield of Egypt. She traveled to Rome, a city that was cold, gray, and crowded compared to the gold and white marble of Alexandria. The people there did not welcome her with open arms. They hated foreign queens and feared her influence over their leaders. They whispered about her in the markets and mocked her Egyptian clothes in the streets. Cleopatra walked through the Roman Forum with her head held high, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She wore her crown with pride, knowing that every mistake she made would be used against her by her enemies. She had to be perfect in every public moment, showing the world that Egypt was not a prize to be taken, but a partner to be respected. She faced seasons where the Nile did not rise and the fields became dry, brown, and cracked under the sun. She saw the greed of Roman generals who wanted to strip Egypt of its ancient wealth to pay for their own wars. To protect her people, she had to be a master of many masks. She was a loving mother to her children, teaching them the history of their ancestors. She was a brilliant commander to her navy, inspecting the ships and talking to the sailors. She was a goddess to her subjects who worked in the hot fields, providing them with stability and hope. There was no rest for a woman who carried the sun on her back. This was the long struggle of her life, the years of discipline, practice, and slow, steady progress. She learned how to balance the heavy needs of Rome with the delicate needs of Egypt. She learned who to trust with her secrets and who to watch with a careful eye. She built a navy that became the pride of the Mediterranean, with ships that looked like floating palaces. She turned Alexandria into the center of the world's knowledge, where the greatest minds came to study the stars and the human body. It was not a fast victory won in a single day. It was a life of hard work and sharp thinking. Every decision she made was a brick in the wall she built to protect her kingdom. She negotiated trade deals that brought spices from the east and tin from the west. She made sure the temples were repaired and the old stories were told to the next generation. She knew that Rome was like a hungry lion, always looking for more territory. She had to feed the lion just enough to keep it from attacking, but not so much that it grew too strong. This was a dangerous game that required nerves of steel and a heart of ice. As the years passed, her hair began to show lines of silver, but her mind only grew sharper. She realized that her life was a bridge between the ancient world of the pharaohs and the new world of the Romans. She worked to make that bridge strong enough for her children to walk across. She did not complain about the weight of the crown or the loneliness of the throne. She simply did what was necessary, one day at a time, one decision at a time. She was a queen not because she was born to it, but because she earned it every single morning. Her greatest breakthrough came when the Roman world split in two after the sudden death of Caesar. She found a new partner in Mark Antony, a general who was as bold as he was powerful, and together they dreamed of something the world had never seen. They envisioned an empire that combined the military strength of Rome with the rich culture of the East. For a short time, it seemed she had achieved the impossible. She was the most powerful woman on earth, holding the keys to the world's most valuable grain and trade routes. Her children were named as royalty, and her palace was filled with the finest art from every corner of the known world. She reached the height of her public attention, with kings from distant lands coming to bow before her throne. The markets of Alexandria were filled with the scent of spices, the shine of silk, and the weight of gold. She had successfully turned a bankrupt country into the jewel of the ancient world. Her name was spoken with awe and respect from the deserts of Africa to the hills of Europe. But power is like the tide of the Nile. It eventually pulls away from the shore. A new leader rose in Rome, a man named Octavian, who was cold, calculated, and extremely patient. He did not care for the beauty of Egypt or the grand visions of Cleopatra. He only cared for total control. He began a war of propaganda against her, telling the Romans that she had cast a dark spell on Antony. He turned the world against the queen he could not control with simple threats. The grand dream began to crumble under the heavy weight of Roman steel. At the Battle of Actium, her navy was defeated by Octavian's disciplined ships. She saw her world falling apart, but she did not panic or scream. Even as the enemy soldiers approached the high walls of her city, she stayed in her palace. She watched the horizon with a steady, quiet gaze. She had reached the ultimate breakthrough of her life, and now she had to face the inevitable end of it with dignity. She knew that Octavian wanted to lead her through the streets of Rome like a common criminal. He wanted to show the world that Egypt was finally defeated. Cleopatra understood that her final breakthrough would not be a victory in battle, but a victory of the spirit. She began to prepare her palace for the end, surrounding herself with the symbols of her power. She wanted the world to remember her not as a loser, but as a queen who chose her own path until the very last second. She looked at her children and knew their lives were in danger. She worked to secure their safety as much as she could in a world that was becoming Roman. Her heart was heavy, but her mind remained as sharp as a diamond. She had played the Game of Thrones for decades, and she knew that the final move was the most important one. She stood on her balcony one last time, feeling the warm wind of the Nile on her face, and prepared for the final chapter of her epic story. The end of Cleopatra's life is a story of ultimate control. She chose her own exit rather than being led through the streets of Rome in chains by Octavian. She died in her palace, surrounded by the gold and incense she had fought to protect throughout her reign. But her story did not end with her last breath. She remains the most famous woman in human history. Why does her name still echo in our ears after 2,000 years? It is not because of her wealth or her beauty. It is because of her unbreakable spirit. Cleopatra teaches us that we cannot always control the storms that hit our lives. We cannot stop the wind from blowing or the tide from turning, but we can control how we stand within those storms. She used her mind as a shield. She used her voice as a bridge. She was a woman who refused to be a small note in someone else's book. Her life was a lesson in the power of education and the strength of the human spirit. She showed that intelligence is the greatest weapon a person can possess. Even in her darkest moments in the desert, she never stopped thinking. Even when the world was against her, she never stopped dreaming. She turned her failures into lessons and her crisis into a new beginning. She was the last and greatest queen of her line. As you go to sleep tonight, my friends, remember her courage. Think of the challenges in your own life and how you can face them with a sharp mind and a brave heart. We are all connected across time by the struggles we face and the ways we overcome them. Thank you for sitting with me by the fire today. I hope this story has brought you a little light in the dark. Until next time, my friends, sleep well.